welcome to Poetry. We've got the Poetry Beatnik cat up here welcoming you. This video is all about poetry and a strategy for understanding new poems called SCASI. So let's get started. The question I want you to have in your mind, how can I make poetry not so hard to understand? Got some great quotes here. Genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood. This is T.S. Eliot. The poet Rita Dove once said that poetry is language at its most distilled and most powerful. Edgar Allan Poe said that poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty. We're dealing with art, folks. Let's get to it. Making sense of poetry is our unit, and we've got some essential questions, including what are some good strategies for making sense of poetry? What makes poetry different from other literary genres? How can I analyze, evaluate, and interpret poems I've never seen before? How can the form and structure of poems inform meaning? How do I write a successful paper one guided literary analysis? So that's what's going to organize our unit. And this question is what we're answering for this particular lesson. All right, so key differences between poetry and prose. And I've got this word up here, verse. Verse is another word for poetry. And so I guess I need to tell you what prose is too, right? Prose is anything that isn't poetry. So it's most writing. And most of the writing that you've read, that you've analyzed, has been written in prose, hasn't it? Short stories, novels, articles in the newspaper, textbooks are all written in prose and not poetry. And so that's something that we have to understand, that this is a very different genre and it's something that you haven't spent a lot of time reading. Poetry comes from Greek, poieo, I create. And according to poetry.org, the definition is an art form in which human language is used for its aesthetic qualities in addition to or instead of its notional and semantic content. Aesthetic meaning the beauty of something, notional and semantic having to do with ideas and literal meaning. And so one way to think about it is that poetry really favors beauty over logic. Also, a key difference between poetry and prose is that poetry is from an oral tradition. It originated as an oral tradition long before any writing systems existed. And it started really as a way to pass down stories. If you could remember a story, you could pass it down. Well, how do you remember it? What makes it easier to remember? Using things like rhythm, a certain repetition, rhyme. These are ways that we can memorize more easily. And so that's really how poems began, as these memorized stories passed down from one generation to the next before written systems existed. And so it was also a way for myths and legends to be shared with the next generation. If you think about it, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, those are epic poems. And that is how they were originally told, as poems, telling some of the most important stories of the ancients, of their gods and goddesses, and of their heroes. Also, poetry uses devices that emphasize musicality and spoken language over more than prose. And these do include rhythm, rhyme, and repetition, making it easier to memorize, making it just pleasant to listen to. That's the musicality of it. And today's most common poetry is really song lyrics, isn't it? And so you can see how the musicality continues. Sound of sense is something else that's important. This is a term coined by Robert Frost, the American poet who was writing about 100 years ago. And he said that what was different with poetry, and really what was most important about poetry, was that it had a sound of sense that was understood before or differently than understanding the words that are in the sentences. And so he said that this was the sound and sense of a poem that were the most important and that this meaning, the way that it sounds, could be created without really understanding what those words are. So the analogy that he gave was if you're listening to a conversation on the other side of a wall or a heavy door. You can't hear what the words are, but you can hear the type of conversation that it is. And you can probably know a lot about what the people are saying and how they're feeling based on just hearing those sounds of the sentences. How fast, how slow, the intonation, where the rhythm is, if there's repetition, the volume, all of these different things. And so the sound of sense is key to understanding poetry. The last aspect about the oral tradition that's important, that makes poetry different from prose, is the communal experience. The tradition of telling this story to a listener means that everyone is there together, experiencing it at the same time. And so there's a community and a cultural identity between the speaker and listener that's created through the process. How about why it's harder for students? First of all, it's because you haven't done as much poetry analysis as other analysis, or reading just at all. And, so it's going to be more difficult because you've experienced it less, right? But then there's this aspect of poetry that we really have to understand, and that does sometimes make it harder for students, which is the fact that it is language in a condensed or compressed form. Just like Rita Dove said, that it's language in its most distilled. And so what we're saying here is really that there are fewer words to say very large, complicated things about emotions and ideas. And the fact that we don't have that expository language explaining what these words mean is important. We have to do more reading between the lines. Every word is important. Poets rely on precision. Each word carries a lot of weight in a poem and contributes significantly to the overall meaning or mood. The poet also uses layered meanings because we don't have as much language to use, right? And they rely on figurative language to convey deeper meanings in a compact way. In a book, of course, authors use figurative language as well, but they also have that expository part where, you've got sentences that describe, explain, or investigate an idea. Think about O'Brien and how he used literary aspects, motifs, and such. But he also had chapters where he just explained what he was doing. I'm writing this way because I think story truth is truer than historical truth, right? And he just explicitly told the reader why and what he was doing. Poets don't do that. Almost, very rarely anyway. Also, poets rely on ambiguity. Poems have multiple meanings and interpretations, and often when you finish a poem, there's a feeling of open-endedness. And instead of being frustrated by that, try to look at it as an invitation to explore meaning. Go back to the poem with questions that you have after reading it and look for the answers or an answer to a question as you reread. Finally, what makes it harder, I think, for students sometimes is the emphasis that poems put on form and structure. And we have a whole lesson in this unit about this. But this is really key, I think, to understand what's different. There are different rules for how we formulate and structure a poem instead of prose. It's not that poetry suddenly has no rules. It's simply that the rules are different. So let's look at those rules a little bit. First of all, in a poem, we do have stanzas, which are a form of paragraph. Sometimes poems only have one stanza, but oftentimes there is more than one stanza, and those are simply verse paragraphs. Also, poems are written using sentences, and we forget that sometimes. And so it's important to look at what the sentences are, where they start, where they end, in order to get a literal understanding of a poem. And the reason we don't see that at first is because poets use line breaks to distinguish one line from the next within the sentences. Also, there's a rule about capitalization. The first line of or the first letter of each line in a poem is supposed to be capitalized. Now, modern poets love to break this convention, and they do it all of the time. But it's not that just that there's a new sentence. That it's not just that you capitalize at the beginning of a sentence, it's at the beginning of every line. And so that's a little bit different in poetry as well. So let's take a look at this. This is the first poem in your packet. You can turn to it if you want to right now. I'm going to read it to you the way that it's meant to be read, which is to pause only at punctuation, not necessarily the end of a line. Planting a sequoia. All afternoon, my brothers and I have worked in the orchard, digging this hole, laying you into it, carefully packing the soil. Rain blackened the horizon, but cold winds kept it over the Pacific, and the sky above us stayed the dull gray of an old year coming to an end. In Sicily, a father plants a tree to celebrate his first son's birth. An olive or a fig tree, a sign that the earth has one more life to bear. I would have done the same, proudly laying new stock into my father's orchard, a green sapling rising among the twisted apple boughs, a promise of new fruit in other autumns. But today we kneel in the cold planting you, our native giant, defying the practical custom of our fathers. Wrapping in your roots a lock of hair, a piece of an infant's birth cord, all that remains above earth of a firstborn son. A few stray atoms brought back to the elements. We will give you what we can, our labor and our soil, water drawn from the earth when the skies fail, nights scented with ocean fog, days softened by the circuit of bees. We will plant you in the corner of the grove, bathed in western light, a slender shoot against the sunset. And when our family is no more, all of his unborn brothers dead, every niece and nephew scattered, the house torn down, his mother's beauty ashes in the air, I want you to stand among strangers, all young and ephemeral to you, silently keeping the secret of your birth. Okay, so this is the first poem. It's okay if you don't have a ding, ding, ding. I know exactly what this poem is all about, right? Because it's just the first time that we've read it. And the reason why I'm reading it to you right now is just because I want to show you what it would look like if it were written in prose as opposed to poetry. All right, this is poetry. This is prose. This is how it would look if it were a paragraph. So you can see that we no longer have the capitalization inside sentences, just at the beginning and the end. We no longer have the line breaks. We no longer have the stanza breaks. It's all one paragraph. And we have to remember, I think, sometimes that this is all poetry is. It's just written a little bit differently. If I were to give you this, it might be less scary for you. It doesn't have the weird rules. It doesn't have the numbers. It's just a paragraph, right? Well, remember that about poetry. It really is just the same. It's sentences written together in a different way than prose. All right, so we're going to come back to this poem, but first we have to finish up our notes. So first of all, you will be writing a guided literary analysis at the end of this unit as the end of the unit summative assessment. A guided literary analysis is a close, detailed examination of a piece of literature, and it's typically a short piece of literature. It involves close reading, literary appreciation, reading between the lines, and an understanding of the effects of literary features. Those things probably sound familiar. We've been doing them already. But for this kind of writing, we're focused on just a few lines, just one page of writing, really, just one poem. And not looking at anything about the author, why they wrote it, who they were thinking about, what was going on in their lives, what the literary era was in which they were immersed. It's really just the words on the page that we're looking at. And there's one final difference. You will be writing a timed essay on a poem at the end of this unit. And I'll make it fair and I'll make it doable, so you don't worry about it. I'll explain it later, but that is the end goal. Now, if you're testing an IB, you will be doing this for the paper 1 exam. And so all of Unit 5 works on helping you prepare for Paper 1, which is the guided literary analysis. It's worth 35% of your IB score, and it's a 2.5-hour exam that you take in May. And for that test, you will actually have 2 unseen passages. One will probably be a poem, and one will probably be something else. And you'll, that something else will be from one of the other 4 genres: prose fiction, prose nonfiction, or drama. And for each passage, they will give you a guiding question, which asks students to consider a technical or formal aspect of the passage. There will be materials that you can use to prepare for this in May. Here's the question for each passage. And so you'll be writing 2 short essays for the May exam, Paper 1. All right, let's move on to the strategy now. It's called SCASI. SCASI is an acronym for Setting, Characters, Action, Style, and Ideas. It's a great strategy to use when you encounter a brand new poem or short text without using historical context. And using SCASI is a good way to break down a prose extract or a poem so that we can think about it in an organized way. So each letter, of course, stands for one of those items. And let's talk about the first. S for setting. Is there a place? What is it? How is it described? And how, as a reader, does it make you feel? Sometimes poems don't have explicit places, but they have hints that we are in a certain place. And so you can look for those as well. In Planting a Sequoia, we do have an explicit place. C stands for characters. Who's involved? Who is the speaker of the poem? That's the person doing the talking, which is different than the poet. The speaker is not the same as the poet. We have to separate those in the same way we separate a narrator from an author. What are the speaker's attitudes, their feelings? What other people are involved in the poem? And what do we know about them? So those are the questions you'll be answering when you look at the C in SCASI. For A, we have action. What action takes place, or what is the situation? In other words, what, if anything, is going on? Again, sometimes there's not a lot going on in poems. It's more reflections that a poet is having. But we have action taking place in Planting a Sequoia, and so we can answer questions about that. S, style. What's interesting about the words and the way they're arranged? We're not going to deal with this one yet. We'll come back to it in the next lesson. So I stands for ideas. What's the idea, either stated or underlying or topic? What ideas surface in the text and what are their larger implications? All right, so that's what SCASI stands for. The next is to actually apply these questions to the poem, Planting a Sequoia. All right, so take a look at your version of Planting a Sequoia in your packet, and let's first look at setting, characters, and action. And I've highlighted the text where we can see some evidence of setting, characters, and action. And if you want to do the same, you sure can. What I do want you to do in your packet is to take some notes about what the setting is, who the characters are, and what the action is, where it denotes that in the margin of the page. All right, so in the first stanza, all afternoon my brothers and I have worked in the orchard. So now we know that we're in an orchard and that it's the afternoon. So setting is both where and when we are. Digging this hole, laying you into it, carefully packing the soil. Rain blackened the horizon. That has to do with setting. It's creating certainly a mood there with that imagery of rain blackening the horizon. And that is what setting often does, is to create a mood. But cold winds kept it over the Pacific, and the sky above us stayed the dull gray of an old year coming to an end. Okay, so the winds are over the Pacific, so we know we are on, like, if we're in the U.S., we're on the western coast. Dull gray, old year coming to an end, it sounds like we are in the winter time, right? So those are all details about setting, and some of them are more important than others, but finding them all at first is helpful so that you have a clear understanding of where and when we are. This is to help us with the literal meaning of the poem. we hear in the second stanza about a different place. In Sicily, a father plants a tree to celebrate his first son's birth. An olive or a fig tree, a sign that the earth has one more life to bear. I would have done the same, proudly laying new stock into my father's orchard, a green sapling rising among the twisted apple boughs, a promise of new fruit in other autumns. So I have some more setting words, but this is kind of a hypothetical stanza because he says, I would have done. So this isn't what he's doing. This is what he would have done in Sicily if he was celebrating his first son's birth. So the question you're probably asking right away is, well, what the heck is he doing if he's not doing that? The third stanza, but today we kneel in the cold, planting you, our native giant, defying the practical custom of our fathers, wrapping in your roots a lock of hair, a piece of an infant's birth cord, all that remains above earth of a firstborn son, a few stray atoms brought back to the elements. So here we're back to the today. We're back to this orchard on the Pacific, and we're in the cold, right? And we have really not as many references to setting in those last two stanzas. So let's go back to the sea for characters, okay? Now that we have a clear understanding of where we are. We're in an orchard on the Pacific Ocean, and instead of being in Sicily planting a new tree in his father's orchard, he is planting you, our native giant, in the cold. So let's see if we can get at what else is going on here by looking at characters. So the C in SCASI is characters, right? So who's doing the acting? Who is in the poem? We've got the speaker, and it's a first-person speaker, right? All afternoon, my brothers and I. And so we know we have the speaker. We're going to ask, what do we know about him? And then what do we know about the other characters? My brothers and I. And then we have a you. So the poem is directed towards someone, you. And who is this you? Well, what do we know about the I? We know that he is planting you in the orchard with his brothers. We know that he would have planted new stock, a new tree, in either a fig tree or an olive tree in his father's orchard. But instead, he's planting you. And then here he tells us who you is. Our native giant. Well, let's go back to the title, Planting a Sequoia. What is a sequoia? We're told at the bottom it's a giant coniferous tree. Also, it is the native tree of California, Pacific. So the speaker is planting a sequoia and referring to the sequoia as you. If you didn't get that right away, that's okay. It might take a little bit more. How else would we figure it out? Well, by looking for more clues, right? Here's another clue, your roots, right? We're planting you, you have roots, and you are in the corner of the grove, bathed in western light, a slender shoot against the sunset. These are all references to a young tree, right? And he imagines in the future that he wants you to stand among strangers. He's talking about a tree standing among other things that they don't know that are young and ephemeral, and we know ephemeral means lasting for a short time when we look that word up. Got to look up words you don't know. And it's keeping the secret of your birth because it doesn't say why it's there. Well, what is this secret of its birth? That's probably the last clue that we have to understand to really understand this poem. And it has to do with the last character, a firstborn son. Let's look at this stanza again. But today we kneel in the cold, planting you, our native giant, defying the practical custom of our fathers, wrapping in your roots a lock of hair, a piece of an infant's birth cord, all that remains above earth of a firstborn son, a few stray atoms brought back to the elements. So this last character is the firstborn son and what has happened to this firstborn son. We know from this line here, all that remains above earth is an infant's birth cord, that this firstborn son has died, and probably died as an infant, because most people don't keep the umbilical cord, right? We will give you what we can, our labor and our soil, water drawn from the earth when the skies fail, nights scented with the ocean fog, days softened by the circuit of bees. We plant you in the corner of the grove, bathed in western light, a slender shoot against the sunset. And when our family is no more and all of his unborn brothers dead, the child was the firstborn. There weren't any other children born. They're right now unborn. The speaker thinks he'll have more children. Every niece and nephew scattered, the house torn down, his mother's beauty, ashes in the air, to stand among strangers, all young and ephemeral to you, silently keeping the secret of your birth. So let's look at action last. Action is blue. What are they doing? They're working in the orchard, digging the hole, laying you in it, packing the soil. They're planting the tree. They're kneeling, planting, defying the practical custom that's explained in this stanza of what's done in Sicily when a firstborn son is born. Wrapping with the roots these pieces of the firstborn son. Talking about giving you land, labor, soil, planting you in the corner of the grove so that you can get good sun, and then wanting this future where the tree stands among strangers. It might be helpful to go through stanza by stanza to look at what is happening, what is being done in each stanza, and you could do that as well. In this stanza, this is what we have done this afternoon, planting in the orchard. The second stanza is really that odd one because it's the hypothetical, right? It's the practical custom of our fathers that he would have done. The third stanza is back to what we're doing. And now he says why, basically by saying defying tradition. They're going against the tradition. And we understand why now too, right? Because the son has died. And then the last two stanzas are a little bit different. They are about the hope for the future. It's using the future tense and then the hypothetical outcome of what's going to happen with this tree as it grows older. The last part of the SCASI is ideas, and ideas you can do kind of the literal idea of like what's happening here. You can just write down that the speaker is planting a tree in memory of his unborn son, which is against the traditions of his ancestors. And I've underlined a couple lines where I feel like ideas are coming through. You could do the same if you wanted. As far as like the larger implicit ideas that aren't explicit but are underlying, I think that you have to think about why he wants to leave this tree there. This tree that will outlive his whole family without any kind of message about why it's there, why it was originally planted, how it is a landmark in a sense for this this child who died, keeping the secret. And I think there are different ways to go with that, which is the cool part of poetry. I know this got long. Thanks for hanging in there. And let me know what questions you have. You've got a SCASI to do of your own on a totally different poem. I hope you enjoy that one.